Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's training on how to engage in grassroots legislative advocacy. We really appreciate everyone taking time out of their busy schedules to take part in this training, and we're just really excited to work with you all. So before beginning the training, we're just going to go through an agenda of what today's training will be about. First, we will start with an overview of grassroots legislative advocacy, basically what it means as a concept and why it matters. Next, we'll describe the process for how a bill becomes a law. We will focus specifically on identifying what we call engagement points, or places where community activists and organizers can try to influence the process. We will then move on to discuss how to influence the legislative process, focusing specifically on public hearings and power mapping, and focusing on giving you all the tools you'll need to be able to do these on your own. We will then break into groups for 2 exercises that will give you all a chance to put some of these tools into action. And finally, we will end up with a wrap up and review. So what exactly is grassroots legislative advocacy? Grassroots legislative advocacy describes the ways that grassroots organizations and community organizers can engage with and influence the legislative process to help create new laws and repeal old laws. One example of a grassroots advocacy campaign, for example, is a year-long campaign in Massachusetts to provide driver's license to undocumented folks, which recently was passed into law. Simply, in this training, we'll be focusing on exploring the ways that community activists and organizers can influence the legislative process to center issues important to their communities. Our overall aim in this training is to give you all an understanding of what the legislative process looks like and the ways that you can make it into your own work for your own communities. At this point, we also want to call out the fact that legislative advocacy process is inaccessible to many people because it has deliberately designed to only be accessible to certain groups and people. As such, the process itself ultimately limits what we can achieve through using it. That being said, our aim in this training is to empower you to make this process work for you as best as we can to get our communities as close to our goals as possible.
So to make the legislative process work for us and our communities, we need to first understand how a bill actually becomes a law. So the process for how a bill becomes a law is called the legislative process. It differs from state to state, but we will be discussing Massachusetts in our training today. So this is quite a complicated process which involves several different steps, which we will be going into in detail over the following slides. But we wanted to start out by mapping this all out for you all on this roadmap to help give you all an overview of the overall process. The first thing to understand is that this all takes place over a 2-year period known as a legislative session. Each legislative session begins in an odd-numbered year and ends in an even-numbered year. The second important thing to know here is that all of these different points on the legislative process are places where a bill can fail. Ensuring that a bill becomes a law means making sure that a bill keeps moving forward throughout the process and that it is able to successfully navigate every step along the way. So the way I like to visualize the legislative process is almost like you're trying to cross a mountain. So you're on a narrow path and you have to get to the other side of the mountain by climbing over it. Along the way, there are a number of things that could stop you from getting there. You could, for instance, slip and fall, you might encounter bad weather, the path may be blocked, and you have to find another way forward. But the only way that you'll ever be able to get to the other side is if you keep going. The legislative process is a lot like this. If a bill doesn't have enough momentum behind it to keep going, it will fail. And at any point along the way, the bill can become stuck and not make it to the next stage. Our training today is focused on giving you all the tools to help ensure that your bill keeps moving. So the first step in the legislative process is finding bill sponsors and drafting the bill. This takes place at the beginning of a legislative session. First of all, to be able to introduce a bill into Massachusetts State Legislature, a legislator will need to introduce it into the legislature on your behalf. You will need to identify a legislator in both the House and the Senate who you think might be willing to work with you to draft and sponsor the bill. So perhaps you already have a legislator that is sympathetic to your issue or has worked with you in the past. If not, you will need to find one. Certain bills, such as money bills, which raise revenue, have to be approved by the House before the Senate can even consider it. But in most cases, for you all, other legislation can be considered first by either branch. Once you have identified a legislator in the House and Senate, you then move on to drafting a bill. This is when you actually get to write the bill. This is the language that will become law if it is passed. So, for instance, if you want to repeal an old law, you'd include language here that would state that certain current laws are repealed. In order to be considered by the state legislature during the current session, the final bill then needs to be filed by the legislator with the House or Senate's clerk's office by the third Friday of January in the first year of the legislative session. So the next step is, once a bill is filed, it is then assigned to a joint committee, which then considers the proposed bill and ultimately makes a determination as to whether it should proceed or not. These committees are called joint committees because they have members from both the Senate and the House. The committee a bill is assigned to is usually determined by the nature of a bill. For example, if a bill is related to healthcare, it will likely be considered by the Healthcare Financing Joint Committee. If a bill is related to repealing a current law, such as a bill to decriminalize sex work or common night walking would be, for example, it will likely be considered by the Judiciary Joint Committee. The job of a joint committee is to consider the bill and then issue a report regarding whether or not the bill should proceed. As part of this, it will hold a public hearing, which is a really important opportunity for members of the community to weigh in and give their views as to why a bill is important and why it should be passed. Community members can weigh in through giving written or oral testimony, which we will discuss later. Once the Joint Committee has considered the bill and conducted the public hearing, the Joint Committee then makes its recommendation as to whether the bill should proceed or not. So, for instance, the bill could read out a bill favorably. This is essentially the committee recommending that a bill pass, and this can be done with or without an amendment to the bill that the committee makes. The committee could also read out a bill unfavorably, which is essentially the committee saying that the bill should not pass. And at this point, the bill then typically fails. The third option is that the committee could give the bill a study order, which is essentially the committee saying that the bill needs to be studied further before it is considered by the House or Senate. This usually means that the bill will not pass in this legislative cycle and will likely need to be reintroduced in the future. This is also another opportunity to influence the legislative process here. Community activists and organizers can lobby committee members and the chairperson to recommend that the bill be allowed to proceed, for instance. So if a bill is read out favorably, it is then sent to a second committee. If the bill relates to money, it was often sent to the Committee on Ways and Means first. Otherwise, a bill is typically sent to the Committee on Steering and Policy. And again, just as before, the bill needs to be read out favorably by these committees to proceed. The bill then goes to the Committee on Bills in the third reading, which again has to issue its recommendations. And again, just as before, this is a further opportunity to influence the legislative process through, again, lobbying committee members and the chairperson to recommend that a bill be allowed to proceed. So if the bill is read out favorably from the Committee on Bills in the third reading, it then goes to the floor of the chamber in which it was originally introduced. So if it was introduced in the House, it would go there first. If it was introduced in the Senate, it would go there instead. This is called engrossment. The bill is debated and then voted on. If it then passes in this chamber, it then goes to the other chamber for debate and voting. The important thing to note here is that during the debate in both the House and Senate, lawmakers may also amend the bill. This means that the House and Senate may pass identical bills or may instead pass different versions of the bills. So if both chambers pass identical bills, both chambers then will need to do a final vote on it during enactment. If, however, there's a difference between the two versions of the bills passed by the House and Senate, then it goes to a conference committee that includes members of both chambers to try and iron out these differences. The bill going to the floor of the House and Senate is another opportunity for activists to get involved and try and influence the process. At this point, for instance, community organizers can lobby their representative and senator to vote in favor of the legislation on the floor of the House or the Senate. So this is the final step. If a bill passes the House and the Senate, it then goes to the governor's desk for signature. As I said, this is the final step in the legislative process and the final place that the law can potentially fail. If a governor signs it here, the bill becomes a law. If, however, the governor vetoes the bill, it does not become a law unless the legislature is able to override this veto. To override the governor's veto, the legislature needs to vote with a majority of 2/3 of both the Senate and the House. This is the final opportunity open to communities to try to influence the legislative process by pressuring the governor to sign the bill into law, and if need be, pressuring legislatures to override the governor's veto.
Now that we've discussed what the legislative process looks like, we can now start talking about the ways that we influence that legislative process as grassroots organizers. In particular, we are going to focus on building skills in two areas: testimony and power mapping. The first step in exploring how a community activist can influence the legislative process is to identify the different points for engagement during that process. As we discussed in the previous slides, there are several points during the legislative process where communities can try and influence the process. First of all, activists can influence the legislative process through finding bill sponsors and drafting the bill. This provides a very real way of engaging with the development of laws and influencing the form of legislation. Secondly, committees' public hearings provide a great opportunity for organizers to influence the development of new laws. Hearing from members of impacted communities and their experiences and why a particular bill is important to them is extremely influential in helping form lawmakers' views on different issues. Other touch points within the process include lobbying committee members and lawmakers more broadly to support and pass a bill. Without pressure and momentum behind efforts to pass a bill, they nearly always do not become law. Finally, in the event that a bill does get to the governor's desk, community organizers play a crucial role in ensuring that the governor feels the strength of the community behind a particular piece of legislation. Again, to help visualize all these points where organizers can attempt to influence the legislative process, we've included our previous map to remind you of the process again. Remember that at every step on this process is a step where you can try to influence the process to help keep your bill moving and to build support behind it. Now we're going to move on to talking about public hearings and the testimony that you may be able to provide as a grassroots organizer. In today's training, we're going to focus on public hearings and the way that community organizers can effectively use these forums to engage with the legislative process and attempt to influence lawmakers' decisions. Public hearings offer an opportunity for members of the public to provide their thoughts and views on proposed laws. They are a vital tool for communicating to lawmakers just how strongly a community feels about a potential issue and the strength of community support behind a bill. Members of the public engage with this process through providing testimony in front of the committee, both in written form, but also verbally. There are different types of testimony depending on the perspective of the person providing it. There are policy advisors and academics. That is somebody who usually separate from the community who's providing their perspective on a bill based on their research or academic work. Then there are community activists. This is usually the head of an organization or a similar person who is sharing their view on behalf of the community and the organization. Finally, there are community members or impacted individuals. This testimony is given by an individual member of a community regarding the impact that a bill will have on themselves and other similarly situated members of their community.
Today, we're going to focus on testimony provided from the perspective of a community member or impacted individual. And we'll start by looking at the typical structure that this testimony should take. Testimony can either be written or oral, or both. We'll address each form of testimony. For oral testimony, you're normally limited to 3 minutes. This works out to around 250 to 300 words. You should start by greeting the chair or chairs of the committee and thanking them for giving you the opportunity to share your testimony. You should then begin with a clear affirmative statement. I support this bill or I oppose this bill. It's also important to reference the bill by both its name and bill number. Committees will often hear from lots of folks testifying in one sitting, and it is important to make it clear to them exactly what you are speaking about. Next, introduce yourself. Tell the committee who you are and why you are here. For instance, my name is X and I'm a sex worker from Western Massachusetts. I want to speak about this bill because it is of deep personal importance to me. The next, and perhaps one of the most important points, is to have a clear ask. You need to be clear to the legislators what you are asking them to do. Ask them to support your bill by reading it out favorably, or ask them to oppose a certain bill by asking that they oppose. You need to make it clear to the legislator what you want them to do. End your testimony by thanking the elected officials again for listening and giving you this opportunity to speak. For written testimony, it's basically an expanded version of your oral testimony. You can use this space to expand upon any points you did not get to mention or speak about in full detail in your oral testimony. It is always best to submit both oral and written testimony. Submitting written testimony should be the minimum way of engaging with a hearing if you are not able to testify orally. Writing effective testimony relies on using several different tools and approaches that we discussed today. The first of these is using the tools we discussed in our earlier training about how to frame public policy, which we are going to recap quickly now. The first tool we discussed in that earlier training was how we can lead with values in the ways that we discuss and frame public policy issues. So for example, we can frame the criminalization of sex work as an issue of equality and safety. Sex workers want and deserve the same rights, protections, and safety as other employees from Massachusetts. This appeals to the values that we all share. The second tools we discussed in that training was the ways that we can identify causal stories to attribute cause, blame, and responsibility for a societal problem. So as another example, we could identify the legislature's failure to repeal the common night walking statute here in Massachusetts as causing the police to target sex workers through criminalizing aspects of sex work. Using these tools in your testimony helps to build a persuasive argument for why lawmakers should listen to your testimony and take your views on board. The next tool we will discuss is the way that we can use good storytelling techniques to help construct our testimony. Good storytelling techniques are essential to creating effective testimony because they are engaging and help lawmakers who often come from very different backgrounds to us connect with and understand our experiences. The first point is to root your testimony in your personal narrative. Personal narratives are extremely compelling and persuasive for lawmakers because they are relatable and a lot more engaging than abstract discussions. Lawmakers also represent you and members of your communities. They want to hear from you, and it is important to remind them of the needs and views of their constituents. An average of 7,000 bills are introduced into the Massachusetts legislature each year, and legislators rely on community members to help them determine which to prioritize. The second good storytelling technique is to be yourself and tell your story. Your authenticity is your strongest asset. Personal narratives are only persuasive if they feel real and authentic. They will not come across as authentic if you aren't telling your story in a way that is true to you and that feels like you. Take time to think about your story and how you want to tell this. Don't be worried about having to sound or speak a particular way. It is your story and you should tell it however it makes sense to you. Third, the best stories build toward a clear central message that they want to communicate, often building towards a moral of the story or compelling beginning, middle, and end. Here, your testimony should build towards a central message that relates to the bill that you are supporting or opposing. Finally, be concise and follow a linear structure. As we discussed earlier, you typically only have 3 minutes, and that is about 250 to 300 words. This is not a long time to communicate everything you want to, so really focus on being concise and to the point. Anything you don't get to include in your oral testimony can be included in your written testimony. Linked to this, you should also follow a clear linear structure. By this, we mean that every part of your story should lead on from one another so that it is clear to lawmakers that there is a clear logic to your story. Lawmakers will typically hear testimony from lots of individuals during committee hearings, and it is important to keep them engaged and that they hear your story. If a story is confusing or difficult to follow, this makes it harder for lawmakers to understand. Bringing these two different approaches together, framing public policy tools and good storytelling techniques, helps to create effective testimony that is rooted within your individual experience, while also helping build momentum behind efforts to change the laws. First, it helps to link your story with Black and Pink's bill in the mind of lawmakers and creates a clear connection between your experiences and the bill in front of them. When lawmakers think about the bill moving forward, it will be associated with your testimony and story. The bill will no longer just be a name and bill number. It is something with real-world impact. Linked to this, it also personalizes and humanizes the policy issue. Lawmakers spend their entire lives discussing policy. With that in mind, it is often very easy for public policy to become something that is abstract and separate to the experiences of communities and individual people for lawmakers. By giving testimony in this way, you help show lawmakers that the criminalization of sex work is something that impacts real people in a very real way every day. Finally, through linking your personal experiences and story with the bill in front of them for lawmakers, it ultimately helps connect efforts to pass the bill with individual and communities on the other side of this decision. It is a lot harder for lawmakers to recommend not passing a bill when they have been confronted with the real-world impact of their decision and the consequences they will have on impacted people.
We are now going to move on here to talk about power mapping and how this tool can be used to help community activists in their efforts to organize for power and effective legislative change. So, what is power mapping? Power mapping is a visual tool that community activists can use to analyze power relationships around an issue and help develop a strategy and approach for organizing for power and change. In this training, we are going to focus on the ways that you can use power mapping as a way of exploring the power relationships that exist around efforts to decriminalize sex work in Massachusetts. So before we dive in, we just wanted to show you two quick examples of what a power map looks like. The first thing is to point out is that a power map is all about mapping power around a particular individual you are trying to persuade on a specific issue. This means that you are focused on exploring the potential influence that other groups or people have on a particular person, so that you might persuade them to support your position, and then they might in turn help persuade the individual. So, turning to our examples, together they provide us with a good example of how to structure a power map. The power map on the right shows how you start with the decision maker or other person that you are focusing on as the object of the power map as it relates to a specific issue. You then map out other influences and determine the ways that these influences, whether they're associations or other individuals, interact with each other. The power map on the left shows how you organize and structure these influences on the focus person. You map them vertically based on the level of power or influence they have over focus person as it relates to your objective. So for instance, on the example on the right, the church has reasonably strong influence over the decision maker as it relates to the particular issue being explored. You then place them along the horizontal line based on whether they support or oppose your objective or position and how much influence they have over the focus person. Putting these together, you can then make a plan for lobbying the influences of the focus person accordingly to get them to persuade the focus person to adopt your bill or to minimize their opposition to your bill. The first step of a power map is to identify your focus person or institution. This is a key decision maker or a person of importance in your efforts to seek legislative change. This person or institution will be at the heart of your power map. So for instance, for a bill such as BNP's efforts to repeal common night walking, this could be a key lawmaker who will help decide the fate of the bill. In this instance, a good person to focus on would be the chair or vice chair of the Joint Judiciary Committee, as this will be a key person who will help decide whether this bill will continue out of the committee. If the bill got to the governor's desk and you wanted to ensure that they sign the bill, you would focus on power mapping the governor. Now that you have identified your focus, the second step of power mapping is to map their influences. This is basically identifying all the different people, organizations, groups that have a relationship with or influence over the focus. This could be a community organization, a lobbying group, a campaign donor, work, family, religious, or neighborhood ties. For instance, perhaps the legislator is involved with a church or was previously a small business owner and was a member of the local chamber or commerce. There are many different ways of getting this information. Look at their website. Do they have a particular group or organization? Where did they used to work? Look at their social media accounts. Have they been pictured at certain events, or do they often share content for particular individuals? Think creatively and expansively. The idea is to map all the potential influences over a person. Be thorough and spend time thinking about your focus from multiple angles. Make sure you have mapped out all of your focuses, links, and influences. Remember, you are mapping these on the power map as they relate to a particular issue. An organization's influence over a lawmaker will differ depending on the issue area. For instance, a lawmaker is more likely to be influenced by a teachers' union on legislation related to education than it is for legislation related to some other area like health. Make sure you stay focused on this issue. Now you have mapped out the influences of a focus. The next step is to determine the relational power lines. This basically means exploring the ways that all of the people and institutions you have mapped interact with and relate to each other. Identify the ways they connect with each other. Perhaps a community organization that the focus is associated with also has board members from local businesses that the focus used to work for instance. These connectors between the focus and other people or institutions are called nodes of power and are really important. They will be key to helping to develop a plan for influencing your focus. Explore the ways that these power lines connect. Do they go through the focus or connect independently? For instance, to use the example I just gave, the community organization with the board members from local businesses could have a relationship that is independent of the focus, or the focus could be at the center of this relationship. Understand the scope of the network of power and how it intersects with the focus. The whole aim of power mapping is to help understand the ways that you could potentially try to influence the focus. Now we have mapped out the focus's influences and the way that these influences relate to each other. We can now begin to explore how we might try to influence them. The first thing you need to do is try to identify which of the people and organizations you mapped out as holding power over your focus would be the best to approach to try and influence your focus. What we will call your priority relationships. The best way to start with identifying your priority relationships is to first focus on your nodes of power with the most relational connections. These will likely hold a lot of influence because they have lots of links with other people and organizations working in this issue area. Another way to find potential priority relationships is to identify a node of power that perhaps holds one or more critical relational connections or seems to be extremely influential, even if they do not have as many connections as another node of power. Remember, your focus is on mapping out the best way of influencing your focus. There are multiple ways of doing this, and it will be different for every focus. Once you have identified these priority relationships, you then need to look at whether you or your organization have any links or influence over the priority relationships. Depending on this, you may need to do another power map for these priority relationships to determine how you can try and influence them. Now that you have a power map, your next step should be to make a plan for how you are going to use the information you have learned to try and influence your focus. Power mapping is just a tool to help you understand the power and influence over particular individuals, such as lawmakers, and the potential ways that you can leverage relationships and influences to help achieve your legislative goals. It should only be the first step. It's not important to build on what you have learned. For instance, you could come up with strategies for leveraging the priority relationships you have identified. By now, you should have a very good idea of who holds the most power and influence over your focus. How can you try to influence them and get them on your side so that you can try and get them to influence your focus? For instance, if it's a business organization, are there business angles to your proposed bill that could be used to help build a relationship with them? A power map is also a good way of deciding where to focus your efforts. You have limited resources and time as an activist. You should focus on maximizing your efforts, which a power map will help you do. A power map can also help identify potential obstacles to your goals. Is there a person or organization that holds a great deal of power over your focus but is strongly opposed to your bill? How could you overcome this? These are just some of the questions that a power map can help you explore and answer.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us in this training. We hope that you found it informative and also that you enjoyed it. We're now going to end by handing it over to our training organizations in person to help facilitate the 2 in-person exercises.